Last month, there was an important debate about atheism versus Christianity. The atheist was Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous atheist alive today. And the Christian was a former atheist, and before that, a Muslim, and that was Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, these two people are good friends, and they both used to take the atheist side of the argument. But Ayaan Hirsi Ali recently has converted to Christianity. So this was a very important change for her, and it's a very important issue. And the gateway to understand why it's important, I'm going to talk about. So Richard Dawkins could not understand how Ayaan Hirsi Ali could believe such an absurd doctrine, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and he died and then was brought back to life, and a whole bunch of other irrational things like that. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali said that she believes those things, but she never gave an argument literally for those conclusions. Rather, she argued that the Christian doctrine, the whole tradition, is the source of all the greatness of Western civilization, including science and individual rights and free speech and all of that stuff. And they were at loggerheads over that. She insisted that Christianity is the foundation for all of these things. And Richard Dawkins said, well, not really. The Enlightenment is the foundation. But aside from that, how can you literally believe these crazy, crazy ideas? So there was one thing that they agreed on, and that is that Christianity is far superior to Islam. They recognize that these two religions that are both in the Abrahamic tradition, nevertheless, are very, very different. And that is a clue to resolving this problem in the following way. The Enlightenment as well is made up of disparate, contrary, diametrically opposed ideologies. So whereas Richard Dawkins continually invokes the Enlightenment, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali does not question that they both seem to assume that the Enlightenment is this kind of monolith, this kind of pro-reason, anti-religion, and pro a certain kind of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, certain kinds of liberty. And neither one of them brings up that, no, the Enlightenment is not this kind of monolith. It is actually made up of a very strong Aristotelian element, Aristotle, and a very strong anti-Aristotle or Platonic, or an element of Plato. And those two are as different as night and day, and they have to be separated, okay? And once you look into that, an astonishing paradox arises, an astonishing irony, the most astonishing irony, I think, in the history of Western civilization. And that is that the Judeo-Christian conservative tradition actually is more pro-reason, more rational than the predominant element of the secular tradition today. The religious element, the one that holds mystical, non-rational beliefs, is actually a more rational tradition than the so-called this-worldly secular tradition. Now, how could this be? Now, how can I even argue for this? So let me take what maybe is the easier side first, part of that. How is Christianity so pro-reason and rational? For the first 1,000 years, it was not. For the first millennium, Christianity began as a kind of mystery cult, no more reasonable than all the other crazy cults at that time and even today, the ones that arise today. But something happened in the second millennium, and that was that Thomas Aquinas came upon the works of Aristotle, and he incorporated those works into Christianity. And so from then on, the premise of Christianity was that God created an orderly universe that is understandable through reason as presented by Aristotle, that things had a nature that we could understand, that entities acted causally, so we can trace cause and effect. And if we have examples of one kind of, let's say, bird that act in a certain way, then other birds of that feather will also act that way, that we can develop science because of these laws that Aristotle presented, that the universe is governed by laws, and that by the use of reason we can ascertain them. So what an irony that Christianity became a home of Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian reason. And that's what led to the Renaissance, to the throwing off of just blind following of religious doctrine, of great outpouring of art and then of science, and great improvements in production, where individuals thought they can think for themselves as individuals. Amazing. And yet they kept the veneer of a belief in Jesus Christ and a religious doctrine. And there was, of course, a strong battle or ongoing battle between those two opposing forces. Nevertheless, both forces persisted. And for a long time, the pro-reason part kept gaining in importance in that battle within Christianity, within the Christian world. So then, and then that led to an age of reason and the Enlightenment, and we had thinkers such as Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, John Locke, who, now I don't know about Bacon, but the other two were still devoutly Christian men, but they held that God created an orderly universe and we could understand it by laws. Newton understood the laws of physics, scientific laws of the physical world, and John Locke endeavored to identify laws of human nature that then led to laws of how individuals should deal with each other socially, and a politics of individual rights. So while that was happening, there was another thrust of the Enlightenment. Philosophers raised questions about the Aristotelian doctrine. They found what they thought were errors or unexplained conclusions. Like how do we form inductive conclusions? How do we really know that there is a causality that's going to persist in the future? We don't see causality. And that, for instance, the philosopher David Hume challenged the whole premise of causality and argued that we cannot know the future from the past. We don't have a logical reason for that. He tore away at the fabric of reason. And then the final Enlightenment philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who really was the end of the Enlightenment, but he was part of the Enlightenment, went on, accepted the premises of Hume, and then argued that, well, yes, we cannot know real reality, but it's our mind that creates the reality we do think we know. And so that was a Copernican revolution. Instead of the mind trying to apprehend what exists out there in the world, it was the mind creating what exists out there in the world. And that is the genesis of what we have today, where I have my truth and you have your truth, and ideas are socially constructed. Those ideas, which we've all heard now in contemporary thinking, came from Kant. So, what a paradox. We have the religious Christian tradition thinking that we can know reality through Aristotelian reason, and we have the other side of the Enlightenment, thinkers such as Descartes and Rousseau, and then culminating with Hume and Kant, saying, well, reason does not really have the answers. So what an interesting thing. And I want to read you a quotation that captures this idea. And this is from a postmodern neo-pragmatist, they call him, philosopher who flourished a couple of decades before now. He died, and his name is Richard Rorty. Now, I don't think he's really a fundamental philosopher that we have to know, but this particular quotation, I think, is so interesting and of utmost importance. So let me read it. Since Kant, philosophers have prided themselves on transcending the, quote, naive realism, unquote, of Aristotle and of common sense. Wow, right? On this naive view, there is a right way of describing things corresponding to how they are in themselves, to their real essences. Scientists, philosophers like to say, are especially prone to adopt this unreflective view. They think they are discovering secrets of nature, but philosophers know that they are really constituting objects by synthesizing the manifold of intuition, or predicting the occurrence of sensations, or wielding instruments to cope with the flux of experience, or something equally pragmatic and anthropocentric. This condescending attitude towards common sense, Aristotle, and science has been shared by people as far apart as Russell, that's Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher, and Bergson, Whitehead, another super famous philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, and Husserl, James, that's William James, very famous, influential philosopher, and Nietzsche, another famous one, Carnap, and Cassirer. Those are more modern thinkers. So that's the end of the quote. So you hear what he's saying. He's saying that modern and contemporary philosophers, for the most part, think that the Aristotelian view of common sense, of naive realism, that scientists can know the world, that's all naive. And it's not really right. They think they're discovering the secrets of nature, but they're not. They're really uncovering these intuitions that we have, the way that or these ways that our mind is putting stuff together. Holy smokes. Now, let me read the next paragraph, or actually the next sentence from Richard Rorty. Until Kripke, that's Kripke, he's what I consider a minor philosopher, even though he's highly thought of today. Until Kripke came along, almost the only exceptions to this consensus were the Catholics and the Marxists. Now, I don't think the Marxists are as much an exception as Rorty is claiming here, and especially not nowadays. And if anything, their view of reason is so much dependent on the ideas of Hegel, the dialectic idea, which is very much contrary to understanding things that have a nature that we can know and then predict the future by. So it's basically only, according to Rorty, the Catholics. Now I will generalize that to more the Christians and some and the Jews too, because they got their fix of Aristotle through Maimonides. But what a paradox. It's the Judeo-Christian tradition that still holds fast to this Aristotelian idea that things have a nature that we can know, and then we can know the future as well. And it's the secular philosophers, the non-religious people, who think, oh, that's just so naive, we know better, we know that you really cannot know. Holy smokes, this is super, super important. What this is saying is that at the very ground foundational level, it is the Judeo-Christian conservatives who have a higher regard for the efficacy of reason than do the secular people. Now, to give some confirmation to that, where do you think a high school student is going to learn the laws of logic? It's not going to be in a public school. It's almost certainly not going to be in what they call a private independent school. It's going to be in a Christian school, like a Catholic school or other kind of Christian school. What college is going to teach the laws of logic? I was an undergraduate at Cornell and MIT. I did not learn Aristotelian logic in those places. If I had gone to Hillsdale College, a Christian university, then I would have learned it. Holy smokes. It's the Christian tradition that is teaching reason and using it and thinking that it actually has efficacy. I am an atheist. I choose to live in the state of Utah, surrounded by Mormons. In fact, I used to live in southern Utah, and now I've moved north to be more immersed in Mormon culture because they are more rational. They talk about Heavenly Father and then deal with reality. Whereas the more secular people talk about reality and how their minds create reality. What do you know? So that's point one. At the very ground basis of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, the Christians are more for the efficacy of reason. Now, many secular people will say that, oh, they espouse reason too, but they don't espouse the efficacy of reason, usually. Almost all of them do not. They will use reason, or what they think of as reason, to undercut reason, to show that it has no efficacy. They'll make up these puzzles like Hume. How do we know that there is causality? I don't see it, I cannot touch it. So how do I know it really exists? How do I know that the future is going to be like the past? How do I know that our concepts really have anything to do with the real world? Aren't they just inventions of the mind, social constructions, right? So they use reason and have constructed these puzzles and challenges that they, nor hardly anyone else, has been able to answer. And so then they throw up their hands and say, well, we cannot know anything. Reason has taught us that we can't reason, or we can't use reason to get anywhere in the world. Wow. Wow. Now, this kind of thinking rears its head in other ways. So for instance, take take now ethics. So the Christians have, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, right? Now, if you ask them to prove or explain why it's wrong to kill or wrong to steal, most of them will probably resort to, well, that's God's word, right? Or we learned that from Christ. Further things from Christ, beyond what's in the Old Testament. And they might not be able to give a cogent argument for these things. But what do the secular people say? They will say, well, we don't know how to derive an ethics from what we observe in the world. They have this saying that you cannot derive an ought from an is, right? So we're kind of aimless when it comes to ethics, when it comes to what we should do. And ultimately, most of them resort to some kind of appeal to feelings. They might say something like, well, evolution has made us into empathetic beings. We have empathy for one another. Now, how they know that for sure, if you challenge them, they'll say, well, I don't really know that either. But others might resort to other feelings of hedonism. And they may construct these other ethics, but none of them will claim, or almost none of them, or none of them will have a valid claim for knowing these things, and they will eventually appeal to their feelings. And so then they will come to doubt things like, is it wrong to steal or wrong to kill? Well, it depends on what the society thinks. Some societies, it's okay in some societies to steal, so that's okay. And we have that cultural relativism, right? Relativism. So look what's happened. The Christians have a more reasonable ethics. They cannot prove the whole thing, but it has a lot of common sense to it. Not all of it, because the first commandment is, to believe in God, right? So there are mistakes in there, but there's also a lot of wisdom. And what's happened is people on the secular side have said, well, we can't know those things, and we know there's not a God, so we don't know what we believe in ethics, and we're just going to resort to what we feel in the long term or the short term. And there we have it. So, I see this here in Utah. The people who do believe in the Christian doctrine, the Mormon doctrine, think that you should be productive. They pray, and when they pray, they express their gratitude to their Heavenly Father and to Jesus Christ. And then they also express their request to have the ability, the wisdom to understand things and to act accordingly. They don't ask for written out answers or whole answers about what to do. They ask for the wisdom, for the ability. And then they accept that they have to use their own abilities, which come down to essentially their reason and their free will, their reason and their agency, as they call it, to flourish, to make the right decisions, to be productive, to be good to their families and their fellow men, and to flourish and have a happy life. Whereas the people who leave the religion, often in disillusionment or anger about some doctrine, will totally go in another direction. They'll say, I reject these doctrines of the church, so I'm going to do whatever I feel like. I was taught that I should be rational. I'm just going to do whatever comes to mind. I was taught that I should be married to one person of the opposite sex. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be promiscuous. I was taught not to take drugs or alcohol. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to become a drug addict and and drink. And I'm going to put I was taught to be well groomed, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put body piercings and tattoos all over my body. I'm just going to follow my feelings. Who's better off? There are essentially two ways that people can go wrong. The right way is to follow your reason, this faculty that we humans have that make us able to know the future and act to further our lives. The one wrong way is to put faith, unquestioning allegiance, or acceptance of some authority, like a church or a family or a government or whatever, and just follow along the authority without thinking things through for yourself. That's one way to go wrong. The other way is to say, I'm just going to follow my own feelings. I'm going to indulge whatever feelings come up. Now, which of those two wrong ways usually turns out worse? Well, it depends on the authority that you follow. If you follow the authority of Islam, you might end up really, really in a bad way, and really, really bad toward others as well. If you follow Christianity, it's a mistake just to follow blindly, but there's a lot of wisdom in the traditions of the Christian culture, because these traditions have been tried and true. It turns out it really is practical to be married to one person over the course of a lifetime instead of being promiscuous, right? And they cannot always explain why that's better. They'll say that's God's plan and we should follow God's plan. And it's God's plan, you shouldn't steal from other people and so on. But following God's plan in those ways turns out a lot better than just following your impulses, indulging your emotions. And that's what we've been left with as an alternative so much so today, is the traditions of the Judeo-Christian culture versus anything goes. So if I feel that even though I was told that I was a boy, I feel like I'm a girl, so I'm going to be a girl. There's no end to the lunacy of the indulgence of emotion that has now come to the fore in the secular world. What an irony. And this comes back to that in the Enlightenment, there was not just one monolithic ideology, just like there's not a monolithic religion in the West. There's, the Christians and the Muslims are very much different. And the Aristotelian element and the subjective Kantian element in the Enlightenment are also opposites. And that has to be understood. So you cannot just blindly accept the Enlightenment and think, oh, now you're okay. You have to look at those two things. And I would argue that you have to choose the Aristotelian one. And the reason the Christians are better right now is because they have chosen the Aristotelian side, even with all the flaws of their religion. What an irony, right? So let's I have a couple of other examples here. Take free will. So the Mormons and all Christians think that individuals have free will. And especially the Mormons think this. They don't even believe in original sin, because an individual cannot be responsible for the sins of someone else, such as Adam. Now, most atheists are determinists. They don't think anyone has free will. I was not able to find Richard Dawkins giving a first-hand account of his position on this. I did find a second-hand account that it does seem that he is a determinist, that he denies free will. Now, another famous atheist, Sam Harris, explicitly denies free will and has actually written a little book about that. And many, if not most, scientists deny free will. They will say that free will is an illusion, that in truth, everything is determined by physical laws. And so when we think we're making a choice, we're being fooled. It's an illusion. Now think about what that viewpoint entails. First of all, where's the reasoning in that argument? Consider this. Suppose, the secular people, the atheists say, well, Christianity is ridiculous to think that a man is the Son of God and that he died and then came back to life, right? And by laying on hands, he cures people of illnesses. It's all like a totally fantastical, made-up story, right? And there's no evidence for this kind of thing. Well, and we have to go by evidence, right? But consider this. Suppose we did come across evidence. Suppose some man came down, we all observed it from the sky without any, visible propulsion, and he looked like Jesus Christ, and he laid hands on people and he did cure them of illness. And let's suppose he brought with him people that we knew have been dead. Let's say our own parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. And they came to us and had conversations with us and looked just like they did when they were alive and spoke with us about things that only they knew, that they really did come to life, and that this kind of thing persisted for decades. And billions of other people had the same experience. What then would a secular person reasonably say? He would have to say, well, look, from the evidence now, there really is a Jesus Christ, and he does have these amazing powers, and there really is some kind of God-like entity that has these amazing powers. And I'm convinced now because I saw the evidence. But now let's look at free will. I have a lifetime of experience observing myself making choices, observing myself right now continuing with this talk when I can just instead relax, go lie down, sit down, and do something else. I continually have to expend effort to keep this thing going. And I have experiences like that my whole life. However, I have to focus my mind on a problem until I solve it. To get up in the morning when I don't feel like it, but I choose to do it, right? We all have a lifetime of experiences of us being aware of using our volitional faculty. And other people say the same things to us. And yet, the secular atheists who are determinists say, no, that's all an illusion. That would be like, them saying it's an illusion, for all that evidence I just talked about Jesus Christ. They're denying factual evidence that's available to all of us over a whole lifetime. And they say, well, it's because, and they say it's because these physical laws determine everything. Well, you can say that about anything that you're not aware of this, but there's really behind the scenes this other thing is happening, right? Like God is really pulling the strings for things. By what grounds of evidence is it there that the physical laws govern free will? We don't even have a strand of evidence that explains that the physical laws create consciousness. We have no idea what consciousness comes from. We don't see any chain from the physical laws to consciousness, except that consciousness does arise in physical things of a certain kind, but we don't know how consciousness is created. So what's the grounds for believing that there's some kind of mysterious behind-the-scenes force that's really governing our mind, and we should not believe our lying mind that is aware of us making choices? It's totally contrary to all the evidence. Yet this is what they believe. And they claim that it's the religious people who are irrational for believing in God. You know, a God behind the curtain that's making everything happen. And they'll say that it's these laws behind the curtain that's making us think we have choice when we really don't. Now, what is the consequence of this kind of view? Well, if nobody has a choice, then no individual is responsible for his actions, right? So no individual deserves more happiness, more success than any other, right? Because nobody really made a choice. Think about what the ramifications are for that in human life. Think about your estimation of yourself. There's nothing you can do that will make you think that you did something good. There's nothing to be proud of. There's nothing to evaluate yourself self as something good. There's nothing to love another person for. I mean, imagine being married to somebody that you conclude really did not do anything worth marrying, that she's no better than any other woman. What kind of life is that? What kind of life is it to have a woman as a wife or a man as a husband who does not see your value or appreciate it, or who does not have any value in himself or herself? What a horrible life. Now, that's not the argument against determinism, but that is, a result of that kind of worldview. So think of the consequences of this kind of secular view. Again, how ironic that it's the secular people, for the most part, who have this non-rational, sterile, empty existence. Now we'll get to individual rights. You know, you hear Christian people today say things like, rights come from God, not from government, right? And then the secular people will say, well, we know there's not a God, so rights cannot come from God, so they do come from government. And it's whatever the government says are rights. That's what we go by. Because rights are just a story we tell ourselves. It's just a social construction. And whatever the majority wants, or whatever we feel like doing, or whatever we think we were determined to do by our evolutionary forces, that's what we will call rights. Now, our founding fathers and our founding generation knew better than both of these sides of the argument. They understood that rights are a derivative of the faculty of reason and the faculty of volition. They recognize that human beings, we need to survive, and we need to have a way to protect our ability to survive in a social environment. And the way that humans survive is by the use of their reason, right? We're not the strongest creature. We're not the fastest. We're the smartest, right? We figure out how to hunt by using our mind. We figure out how to grow crops, how to build a shelter. You know, in most of the United States, a man cannot survive a single winter night without a shelter. He's got to build that. And it's not just from his brute strength, right? Or else the roof will fall down on him. He's got to think these things through. He's got to make clothing. Everything he has for his survival comes from his thinking. And so he's got to be free to think and to act according to his thoughts. And then he's got to be free to keep and use whatever he produces, or else what good is producing it if you can't use it for yourself? Or choose how to use it in the way your reason tells you to. So that's why we have the rights of life, liberty, and property in the pursuit of happiness. It's because our means of survival is our rational faculty and our volitional faculty, which actually are inseparable. So one can ask the question, well, how did this faculty get here? And that's where founding fathers or the founding generation disagreed with each other. Most people thought, well, it comes from God. God created man and he endowed us with these faculties. Others thought, well, no, there is not a God. And so these faculties arose naturally in some one way or another. But what they all agreed on was that however this faculty came about, it's here. And we can observe that. We can introspect and observe in other individuals. They have these faculties of reason and volition. And because they have these faculties, individual rights follow. And it doesn't matter where the faculties came from. The question of where the faculties came from was not a question of philosophy. It was a question of cosmology. Where did things come from? In the same way, we don't have to know where the law of gravitation came from or where the laws of motion came from. Newton was a devoutly Christian man, and undoubtedly he thought God created these laws. But you don't have to think that or believe that in order to know that the laws are true, right? However they came to be, they comport with physical evidence, right? So we know they're true. And that's all we need to know to use and apply those laws. In the same way, all that we need to know about the nature of man is not who made him, but what he is now. And he has this nature of reason and volition. And from that, we know that he's got to have his rights to life, liberty, and property. So that's what the Christians back then knew. That's what today's Christians are forgetting because they're falling under the influence of all of these, modern influences. But at least they still recognize individual rights, and they have the common sense to see that these rights are valuable, even though they cannot give a good derivation of it. And this is part of being miseducated. They're not as well educated as our founders were. But at least they still recognize those rights, whereas the secular people, by and large, the atheists, don't recognize individual rights at all. Wow, right? Because those rights are derived from our nature as rational, volitional beings. And so it's the secular people who are devising political ideas that are contrary to a rational being. The so-called reasonable, rational ones, the secular people, are acting contrary to reason in this political realm as well. We covered the realm of, how we know things. We covered the realm of ethics, and then we've covered the realm of politics. And in all three realms, it's the Christians who are more rational, by and large. This is an atheist speaking. Now let's take other issues like family, So many Christians will say, well, God's plan is that we should have a family. And so they haven't thought out a whole argument as to why that's the right thing, but they see the value in having families, right? Whereas the secular people, well, why should I have a family? There's no God telling me that, so I'm going to do what I want. And what I want is not that. I feel like not having that. I feel like being promiscuous my whole life. And who ends up happy and who ends up unhappy? Same with sexuality, right? The Christians have doctrines that say, if you're a man, fall in love with one woman, marry that woman, be with her your whole life and raise a family with her. And if you ask them why, they'll say it's God's plan. And they'll have some common sense idea about how you'll be happy that way, but they might not be able to articulate that in a convincing way. And you go to a secular person for the most part, and they'll say, well, God's plan, that's baloney. So I'm just going to do what I want, what I feel. And they end up being very unhappy in that realm as well. Wow, right? All of these realms. Now, that makes me want to go to read a little summary of all these things that I just have been saying. And it's encapsulated in a short passage from an essay that I wrote some time ago. Here we go. It is far better to believe in the mind of God than to deny the mind of man. It is far better to believe that man was endowed by his Creator with the efficacious faculty of reason than to deny the efficacy of reason. It is far better to believe that individual rights come from God than to oppose of individual rights. It is far better to believe in the eternal soul than that there is no soul. It is far better to believe that God will judge you for your choices than to deny that man has choice. It is far better to believe that masculinity, femininity, and sexuality glorify God than to oppose masculinity and femininity, and to believe that sexuality is mindless. So in that passage, I'm reading about two opposing wrong ideas. Because one side is saying all these directives come from God, and that's a mistake. But the other side not only denies God as the source of those directives, but it denies the directives. Christianity has a lot of wisdom in its culture. It cannot explain all that wisdom. Most of the secular world today denies that wisdom and disposes of it. And this is why we have this crazy alternative today that someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali faces. She probably recognizes that she cannot justify in reason all of these Christian beliefs. But she somehow recognizes that these Christian beliefs are somehow better than the alternative of denying these beliefs, these conclusions. The Christians cannot justify all their conclusions. They cannot answer all the puzzles and the challenges that the modern philosophers have thrown at them. But they know in some way that there's wisdom in their conclusions, even if they cannot give a full argument for them. Whereas the people on the other side throw it all out. Now, a young person facing this alternative is in a rough place because he wants to have not only the right conclusions, but he wants to know why they're right so that he can have the conviction of his conclusions. And that's why it's so important for us to come up with the answers to all these puzzles that the modern philosophers have thrown at us. And to be able to answer why we can know the nature of things, as Aristotle taught, and why we can have an ought from an is, and have an ethics, and why we can understand that we do have free will, and why we have individual rights, and why a marriage between a man and a woman is the proper kind of romantic relationship, and why you should embrace, if you're a man, embrace your masculinity, and if you're a woman, embrace your femininity, and not try to become some kind of hybrid between the two that fails at both. And that's the reason that philosophy is so important to study. Now, I think I have come up with answers to these challenges. My work is in the tradition of Aristotle, and also the largest influence on my work has been Ayn Rand. But I don't think Ayn Rand had all the answers either. And so I diverge from her in some ways, and I have attempted to answer questions that she did not get to or address. But that's the tradition that I recommend people looking into: Aristotle, Aquinas, Ayn Rand, and yours truly. And I want to impress upon all of you that these things are these are not just casual, endeavors. It's not like going out and playing golf or something. This is a life and death matter. People need to know the answers to these challenges. There's just one last thing I do want to cover. And that is something that's been raised, it's called the substitution hypothesis. Some of these atheists, and I know I've heard this from a thoughtful man named Peter Boghossian. He has raised the question, and I don't think he claims to be the first one to have raised it, but these atheists, such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, have spent years trying to arguing against Christianity, trying to convert people out of Christianity into a more secular worldview. And now what they're seeing is that what's taken over the intellectual world is this crazy woke ideology, this postmodernism, where they're trying to tear down everything having to do with Western civilization, everything having to do with reason. And somehow the Christians seem more immune to these forces than the secular people. And some of these atheists have raised the question, is it possible that human beings always need some kind of religious belief so that if we tear down Christianity, they're going to flock to the woke stuff? So my answer to this has two parts. And my answer is no, but my explanation has two parts. First of all, the left, which is now the political cultural left, Marxism, now called woke or postmodernism or social justice, all that stuff, has never fundamentally been against religion per se. It's fundamentally been against Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, not because that tradition is religious, but because that tradition is pro-reason. It's the pro-reason Aristotelian element of the Judeo-Christian tradition that the left hates and they've been trying to destroy. And you can see that because the left embraces Islam, any kind of New Age religion, any kind of cultish fad. They embrace all that. They're uniquely against the Judeo-Christian tradition because that tradition upholds reason. And that is the nemesis of the left, because what they want is pure indulgence of emotion, blind indulgence of their feelings. So attacking Christianity is not what's given the left its permission to embrace these other crazy ideas. The left has always wanted to embrace those crazy ideas and has. They just have less of an obstacle now because Christianity in certain ways has been weakened, the pro-reason aspect of Christianity. And Christianity itself is becoming less pro-reason because of the influence of this postmodern woke virus. Because what's happened is they've drawn a similar conclusion. They've said, well, look, this secular way of thinking, look what it's led to, this kind of disaster. There must be something wrong with that whole chain going back to the Enlightenment. And so they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They're throwing out not only the ideas of Hume and Kant and Rousseau and Hegel and all of that side of the Enlightenment, but they're also throwing out the good side, the Aristotelian side, the side of John Locke, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton. And so that's a terrible mistake. But you can see that to some extent it's an innocent mistake because they don't have the training or the wisdom to know the difference between the good part and the bad part. So that's why it's so important to understand that. And the other reason that the substitution hypothesis is wrong is that people need the alternative that's being given to an integrated worldview like Christianity is deficient. The best secular people who do claim to be pro-reason, people like Peter Boghossian, who's a very thoughtful man, James Lindsay, and so on, they claim to be for reason and evidence. But if you look at their systems, they don't really have a well thought out system. They've got some ready techniques that are not really integrated and don't form a corpus of knowledge, and they don't form a real corpus of methodology. They don't point to things or enough that is certain. Because in order to have, evidence for something or probabilities for something, you have to have a basis of certainty, and you have to have certain things that you know. And those things form a basis that you build other things on. And the best pro-reason factions nevertheless don't have enough of a system to provide that certainty that humans really do need. That's what the Christians need. They don't need this belief in a mystical realm. The best ones do grab onto something like Christianity because they need something to be certain of. And so if they cannot be certain of their religion anymore, it's not that they need another mystical realm to be certain about. They need a methodology to give them certainty about the world in front of them, the world that they perceive. And that's what the pro-reason people have to work to build for them and for themselves. And this is, again, motivation for all of us to be the best philosophers we can be, to read the best philosophy we can find, and if we're convinced by it, take it as our own, and if we're not convinced by it, do our best to discover the missing pieces on our own. So that's all I have to say for today. So bye for now.